So thank you again, everyone, for attending today. We're really excited to share this material with you, and we hope it'll be a building block for you to think about taking the lessons that you learn here into the work that you do with your clients, but also into how you manage your own life and stress that comes up. We really believe in being more educated about this and trying to push the ball forward so that we have more humane workplaces, clinical settings, wherever you find yourselves. So that's what we're here today to train on. So let me just give you a little bit of a preview of the modules we're going to go over. There's 5 different topics we're going to do today. The first one is just trauma basics. It's introduction to what is trauma, some key terms, things like that. Then we're going to talk about what are the effects of trauma and what is this resiliency thing that we hear about, sort of how do we overcome trauma or move through it or past it. And then we're going to switch over to talk about trauma-informed lawyering specifically, and that's broken into 2 modules for you. So values and mindsets, as well as practical advice. What does it actually look like to do trauma-informed lawyering, which we think will be helpful for you as you work with clients. And then lastly, we're going to talk about vicarious trauma, which is our own exposure as practitioners who work with folks who have been through traumatizing events, and how we keep an eye out for ourselves so that hopefully we can be in this work doing good things in the world for the long haul and not find ourselves burning out. Or if we do burn out, learning how do you get back up? How do you put the pieces back together? So that's what we'll cover today together. So part 1, trauma basics. Just going to jump right in here. So what is trauma? Well, it's helpful to sort of split it into 2 things. It's really both an event and then an individual's response to that event. So lots of things are potentially traumatic, but what really turns something into a trauma is if the person on the receiving end of that experience subjectively experiences it as a trauma. So generally what this means is that the individual has a subjective experience where they perceive something that's happening as a threat to their life, their bodily integrity, or their sanity. Lots of events can be traumatic. I think this is almost intuitive. If you've lived in the world a little bit, you know that when you go through certain things, it can be really hard to move past. Physical harm, like accidents or things you don't expect. Emotional harm, like some kind of betrayal or relationship ending can be traumatic. And also observing and hearing about these things happening to others. That goes into the vicarious trauma category, but that's trauma too, or it can be if someone's subjective experience is that they receive it as a traumatizing event. So this is a little bit about trauma responses. I'm not going to read all of the things on these slides, but you guys can go through it at your own pace whenever you'd like. A lot of emotional responses that are coming out or that can come out when someone does experience something as traumatic, and then also physical responses, issues with health and sleep, all sorts of things. So this is just a non-exhaustive list of the ways that our minds and bodies can respond to trauma. Now, one thing that I think is really important to highlight is that it is the individual's experience that determines whether or not something is traumatic. So 2 people can go through an incredibly similar thing and have very different outcomes in terms of whether they received that as a traumatizing event in their life. That being said, though, systemic things play a role. The potential for trauma is often systemic, and the kinds of social injustices that we're aware of in our society create additional vulnerabilities for some individuals, and those vulnerabilities provide just abundant opportunities for potentially traumatizing events. So that's one way to think about that balance between it's very subjective and individual, but we do live in an unequal society, and that means that some people are more exposed to potentially traumatizing events than others over the long term, over their life. This is just a word about PTSD. This gets conflated with trauma. So again, we're in the module where we're doing basics here. Trauma and PTSD aren't the same thing. However, someone's risk for PTSD increases as they have trauma exposure. If you want to learn about PTSD, I encourage you to Google it and learn more about it. It is a clinical diagnosis that is a gathering of several different symptoms. But it is not the same exact thing as trauma, and ultimately just want to make the point that we separate those 2 things. You might have heard the term trigger before. I think this gets thrown around a little bit in a very casual way. But a trigger is actually like a stimuli happening in someone's environment that prompts a recall of a previously traumatic experience. So this can be things like sounds, smells, just the way the environment feels, colors, really anything can function as a trigger. And it's just important to keep that in mind. Some folks that you might work with as clinical students are going to know what their triggers are and be able to tell you those things. Other folks won't really be familiar with that idea and won't know that about themselves, even if they're experiencing triggers. So this is a concept to be aware of. Another concept I just want to flag is trauma bonding. So that's attachment between the person who's been victimized or exploited and the person who's abused them. Sometimes you hear this called Stockholm syndrome. That's like a colloquial way of talking about it, but ultimately this is a very real dynamic. One thing that's really amazing to me about the human psyche is that we can bond in really complex ways with other humans. So it's good to remember that someone's relationship with someone who has mistreated them might be deeply complicated and not just one thing. Complex trauma. This is, I think, a little bit of a newer concept that folks are starting to talk about more, and you're hearing about it more outside of clinical circles. It's really, I think of it as stacking trauma. What happens when someone is experiencing traumatic events and there's not a safe time period where their body and their mind gets to come down from the threat, right? So this is when someone ends up living with a sense of fear or powerlessness over an extended period of time and starts to feel like they have no way out of the situation because they're constantly in survival mode. That's when trauma becomes the norm, and it is different than individual traumatic events that happen to people.